A 4-year-old boy had never taken a single step in his life due to an incurable paralysis the doctors said was irreversible. When the cleaner asked to bring her 7-year-old daughter to work at the mansion, the millionaire agreed without expecting much. But one day, when the father came home from work and saw the empty wheelchair rocking alone on the lawn, his heart skipped a beat. The gardens of the Caldwell estate were an oasis of silence and perfection, where every leaf seemed polished and every flower bloomed in a controlled explosion of color. In the center of the verdant lawn, a child's wheelchair, chromed and impeccable, swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, empty. Its silence was a scream that echoed through the heart of the house, a constant reminder of absent motion. A few feet away, seated on a cashmere blanket, little 4-year-old Arthur stretched out his arm with fierce determination. His chubby fingers opened and closed in the air, trying to reach a small red fire truck that had rolled just beyond his grasp. His eyes, a blue as deep as the sky before a storm, were fixed on the toy, and a small whimper of frustration escaped his lips. He didn't cry. Arthur rarely cried about his limitations. Instead, a relentless stubbornness took hold of him, a force his father, Richard, both admired and feared. From his office window, Richard watched the scene unfold. Each of his son's attempts was a small stab to his chest. He saw the strength in the boy, a spirit that refused to be contained. But he also saw the shadow of sadness that sometimes crossed that childish face, especially when the gardener's sons ran past the gate, kicking a soccer ball and filling the air with laughter that Arthur could only observe. In those moments, the desperate longing to be like them, to run and feel the grass beneath his feet, shone through in his gaze. Richard glanced away to a photograph on his desk, his wife, Beatrice, smiling, her arms wrapped around a prominent belly. She had left them too soon, leaving a void that not even his entire fortune could fill, and a son whose journey would be marked by a challenge she never imagined. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Helena, the housekeeper, a woman with a serene countenance and hands calloused from honest work. She had been with the family for years, since before Beatrice fell ill. It was Helena who had held his wife's hand in the difficult days and who, later, helped soothe the cries of a baby who barely knew his mother. Her loyalty was unquestionable, a silent pillar in that large and often lonely house. "Mr. Caldwell, excuse me. Could I have a word?" she asked, her voice low and hesitant, which was unusual for her. "Of course, Helena, come in," he replied, gesturing to the chair in front of him. She entered but didn't sit. She twisted a cleaning cloth in her hands, a clear sign of nervousness. "Sir, I know it's not my place to ask, and I would never bother you with personal problems, but something has happened." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "And then my daughter's school is closing for a week because of a structural problem. I don't have anyone to leave her with, and I can't miss work. I was wondering if there was any possibility I could bring her with me. She's 7, very quiet and well-behaved. I promise she won't be any trouble." Richard looked from Helena to the small figure of his son in the garden. Arthur was a lonely child, surrounded by adults, expensive toys, and silence. The idea of another child in the house was new, unexpected. He thought of the risks, the complications, but then he looked at the distressed face of Helena, the woman who had cared for his family with such devotion. Her loyalty deserved his trust. "Bring her, Helena," he said, with a firmness that surprised her. Arthur could probably use the company. Immense relief flooded Helena's face, followed by a wave of gratitude that left her speechless. She just nodded, her eyes welling up, and quietly excused herself. That night, as she packed her daughter Leah's small backpack, a whirlwind of emotions consumed her. Leah was a ray of sunshine, full of energy, questions, and an unshakable faith in the stories her grandmother told. Entering this mansion of silent sorrows Would her light be able to illuminate the dark corners, or would it just be a cruel reminder of what life had denied little Arthur? The next morning, a timid sun peeked through the clouds, painting the garden dew with strokes of gold. Arthur was already on his blanket, watching the back door with an expectation he didn't quite understand. Then it opened. Helena entered, holding the hand of a small girl with braided hair and eyes as dark and bright as wild cherries. Leah stopped at the threshold, her eyes wide at the vastness of the house, the high ceilings, and the furniture that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale castle. She shrank a little behind her mother, the colorful backpack on her shoulders looking like a turtle's shell protecting her from the unknown world. Helena approached with a gentle smile. "Arthur, this is my daughter, Leah. She's going to spend the day with us, okay?" Arthur just nodded, his eyes fixed on the girl, who stared back with equal intensity. There was a strange silence in the air, an invisible bridge being built between two very different islands of childhood. Helena left them in the garden with a box of toys and a plate of cookies, and returned to her duties, casting watchful glances through the window every few minutes. For a long time, they said nothing. Arthur pushed his red truck across the blanket, and Leah arranged pebbles into perfect rows. Finally, it was she who broke the ice. She scooted closer, and instead of asking what had happened or if he was in pain, as adults did with their pitying looks, she pointed to his still legs and asked with disarming simplicity, "Why don't you use them?" The question hung in the air, devoid of pity or judgment. It was pure curiosity. Arthur blinked, surprised. No one had ever asked him that way. The doctors used complicated words, his father sighed, and other children just looked away. "I can't," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "They don't listen to me." Leah tilted her head, processing the information. "Oh," she said, as if he'd just told her he didn't like broccoli. Then her face lit up. "Then we have to play something else." She looked at the wheelchair parked beside him. To Arthur, it was an extension of his immobile body, a symbol of his prison. To Leah, it was a fascinating object. "That looks like a race car. We can play tag. I'll run, and you drive," she proposed, her eyes shining with the idea. Arthur had never thought of his chair that way. He always saw it as a burden, but her excitement was contagious. For the first time, the chair didn't seem like a limitation, but a possibility. They spent the whole morning like that, with Leah running and hiding behind the rose bushes, and Arthur maneuvering his chair with an agility that surprised even himself, their laughter echoing through the once silent garden. Later, as they ate cookies, sitting side by side on the blanket, Leah started talking about her grandmother. "My grandma used to live in a place with lots of mountains," she recounted, her mouth full. "She always told me that if you have lots and lots of faith in your heart, you can do anything. She said that love and faith can move mountains." Arthur listened, fascinated. The words were like seeds falling on soil he didn't know was fertile. Mountains, faith, love. They were concepts far bigger than the diagnoses and prognoses that filled his world. The day flew by, and when Helena came to get Leah to go home, a feeling of loss tightened Arthur's chest. He didn't want her to leave. As Leah said goodbye, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, "A secret, just for the two of them. Tomorrow, we'll start practicing to move your mountain." "Okay." Arthur didn't quite understand what she meant, but a strange warmth spread through his body, a small flame of hope he hadn't felt in a long, long time. The days that followed transformed the mansion's routine. The silence, once heavy and melancholic, was filled with the sound of children's laughter weaving through the birdsong. For Arthur, mornings were no longer a slow awakening to a world of limitations, but an eager countdown to Leah's arrival. He would wait for her by the window, his heart beating a little faster each time he saw Helena's car approach up the long, gravel driveway. From his office, Richard watched the transformation with a mixture of relief and apprehension. To see his son smile like that, with such pure and genuine joy, was something he thought he had lost forever. Yet, a part of him, the pragmatic part that dealt with doctors and diagnoses, feared this happiness was fragile, dependent on a friendship that was, by its nature, temporary. But he kept his fears to himself, for the light in Arthur's eyes was too precious to be dimmed by adult doubts. Leah saw no barriers, only creative challenges. She invented treasure hunts where the clues were in low places, within Arthur's reach. She created races where his wheelchair was a powerful rocket that had to reach the moon, a patch of daisies, before she, the alien, could catch him. In her games, Arthur wasn't the boy who couldn't walk. He was the captain, the pilot, the hero, and for the first time, he began to see himself that way too. The wheelchair ceased to be a cage and became his spaceship, his race car, his king's throne. With every new game, a small piece of the sadness that had nested in his heart dissolved, replaced by a confidence he never knew he possessed. On one particularly warm afternoon, they took refuge in the shade of an ancient oak tree at the back of the garden, far from the curious eyes of the house. The air was still, thick with the scent of damp earth and jasmine. Leah, with her childlike seriousness, looked at Arthur. "You know, Arthur," she began, "my grandma said that mountains don't move on their own. You have to push them, with all the strength in your heart." She touched his chest gently. "Your heart is strong. I can feel it." Arthur looked down at his own legs, thin and pale on the blanket. They were his mountain, an impassable range of sleeping muscles and silent nerves. "But how?" he whispered, doubt creeping back into his voice. Leah didn't answer with words. Instead, she knelt before him, her face concentrated. "Close your eyes," she asked, her voice as soft as a secret. Arthur hesitated for a moment, but there was something in her determination that made him obey. He closed his eyes, sinking into his familiar darkness. Then he felt Leah's small, warm hands take his. "My grandma taught me a prayer," she whispered, her breath close to his face. "It's not from a book. It's from the heart. We just have to ask with everything we've got." And then she began to speak, not to him, but to something bigger, with the pure faith of a child who doesn't know the word impossible. "Please, help my friend Arthur feel his legs. Help him push his mountain. We believe he can do it. We really, really believe." She squeezed his hands tightly. "Now, Arthur, believe with me. Think about your legs waking up." He tried. With all the strength of his little soul, he concentrated, imagining his feet moving, his knees bending. At first, there was nothing, just the usual silence, the emptiness. But then, something shifted. A tingle, a minuscule spark, deep in his left calf. He almost dismissed it as his imagination, but it came back, stronger. It was like an army of tiny ants marching under his skin, a strange, electric sensation he had never, ever felt in his life. His eyes shot open under his closed lids. The feeling spread, climbing up his leg, a vibrant, insistent tingling. It was real. He opened his eyes suddenly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Leah, then at his own legs, as if seeing them for the first time. "Leah," he gasped, his voice trembling with astonishment. I felt something." A silence, heavy with wonder, settled between them. The tingling in Arthur's legs was like an echo, a reverberation of something powerful that had just happened. Leah watched him with huge, expectant eyes, with no trace of surprise, as if she had just witnessed the blooming of a flower she had planted herself. To her, this wasn't an inexplicable miracle, but the natural result of faith. To Arthur, it was as if a door that had been locked his entire life had just creaked open, revealing a blinding light on the other side. He looked at his legs, touching them with trembling hands, trying to confirm if the sensation was still there. It was a soft electric current, a promise of life where there had only been numbness. "Again," he whispered, his voice filled with an urgency that startled him. "Leah, Let's do it again. From that day on, the spot under the oak tree became their secret sanctuary. While the rest of the house followed its predictable routine, Helena with her cloths and cleaning supplies, Richard on his business calls, the head housekeeper, Sonia, with her watchful eye. A quiet revolution was underway in the garden. Every day they repeated the ritual. Leah would hold his hands, close her eyes, and whisper her prayer from the heart. And Arthur, with a concentration that demanded every fiber of his being, would focus on the sensation, trying to amplify it, encouraging his legs to awaken. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally. At the end of each session, he would be sweaty and tired, but his eyes shone with a renewed determination. Leah, with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years, turned faith into action. "Grandma said believing is just the start," she explained one day, while gently massaging Arthur's feet. "Then you have to show your body you believe." She started inventing exercises. She would lay Arthur on the blanket and move his legs in bicycling motions, singing little songs to mark the rhythm. She would sit him up with his back against the tree trunk and ask him to try to push her hands away with his feet. They were little games, disguised as play, but Arthur knew they were so much more. They were the first steps on a journey he would have thought impossible just weeks before. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and painting the sky orange and pink, they were at their routine. Leah had positioned him facing the oak tree, holding his hands firmly. "Now, Arthur, try to stand up, just for a little bit. I won't let go." Panic seized him. Stand up. The phrase was so foreign, so alien. His legs were anchors, not pillars. "I can't." "Leah, they're too weak." "No, they're not," she insisted, her voice firm. "They're just sleeping. We're waking them up. Remember? Think about the strength. Push the ground." He looked at her face, at the unshakable confidence in her dark eyes. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and did as she asked. He pushed. With the strength of his arms, he propelled himself upward, and with the strength of his mind, he commanded his legs to help. For an instant, nothing happened. The weight of his body was crushing, but then he felt something different, a tremor. A muscle in his thigh contracted, hard as a rock. Another joined it. Suddenly, he felt the ground under the soles of his shoes. For a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, he was standing. His legs were shaking violently, and he was leaning almost entirely on Leah and the trunk, but he was standing. Gravity felt different. The world seen from this new height was dizzying. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed back onto the blanket, panting, his heart racing. He looked at Leah, his eyes wide, unable to speak. She was smiling, a smile so big it looked like her face might split in two. "I knew it," she celebrated, clapping her hands softly. "I knew you could do it." The joy was so intense it overflowed, and they both felt their eyes well with tears. But in the midst of the euphoria, a new feeling arose. Fear. What would the adults say? Would they believe them? Or worse, would they forbid them from continuing? "Leah," Arthur said, his voice serious, "no one can know. Not yet. It's our secret." Leah nodded solemnly, linking her pinky finger with his. "Our secret," she promised. The sun vanished below the horizon, leaving the garden in twilight, guarding the silent pact of two children who had just defied the impossible. Keeping the secret became a thrilling and terrifying game. For Arthur and Leah, each day was a clandestine adventure, lived under the guise of normality. To the rest of the world, they were just two kids playing in the garden, but under the oak tree, away from adult eyes, they were scientist and subject, master and apprentice, two conspirators united by an extraordinary purpose. That first second on his feet turned into 2, then 3. With each new attempt, Arthur's muscles seemed to awaken from a long slumber, responding to his commands with a painful slowness, but a consistency that bordered on miraculous. They celebrated each small victory with whispers and tight hugs, sharing a triumph only they could understand. The joy was so pure and intense it nearly overflowed, making it increasingly difficult to hide their knowing smiles and meaningful glances. The change in Arthur was subtle, but undeniable. There was a new light in his eyes, a straighter posture in his chair, a confidence that manifested in every gesture. Richard noticed. He saw his son venturing into parts of the garden he once avoided, saw him laugh with an intensity that warmed his soul. He attributed it all to the friendship with Leah, grateful for the girl's presence that seemed to have breathed new life into his lonely son. He didn't question it. He just savored the sight of a happy Arthur, not daring to disturb the fragile bubble of joy that had formed in the mansion. Sonia, the head housekeeper, noticed too, but her interpretation was far different. With her eagle eyes and bitter heart, she watched the growing closeness between the children and her employer's evident gratitude toward Helena with a corrosive jealousy. She saw the influence of the housekeeper's daughter as an usurpation, an invasion of her carefully controlled territory. One afternoon during the third week, the sky clouded over and a light rain began to fall, forcing the children to take their secret operation indoors. They hid in the playroom, a huge, colorful room Arthur rarely used. With the door closed, Leah helped him out of his chair and onto his feet, leaning against a low bookshelf. "Let's try walking, Arthur," she whispered, excitement making her voice tremble. From the shelf to the toy chest, "I'll be in front of you." The distance looked like an ocean. Arthur stared at the polished hardwood floor, which suddenly seemed unstable and treacherous. Fear tightened its grip on his chest again. "What if I fall?" "I'll catch you," Leah promised, positioning herself in front of him, arms outstretched. "And if we both fall, we'll get up together." He took a deep breath, the scent of crayons and new books filling his lungs. He let go of the shelf with one hand, then the other. His body swayed, and for a moment he thought he would collapse. But Leah held his hands tightly, her small body serving as a counterbalance. "One step," she encouraged. Just one." He moved his right leg. The motion was clumsy, dragging, but his foot moved forward and landed on the floor. It was a step, a real shuffling step. The relief and shock were so immense he nearly lost his balance. "You did it!" Leah whisper shouted. "Now the other one." He moved his left leg, then his right again. 3 steps, 3 staggering, miraculous steps that took him from the bookshelf into Leah's arms. They tumbled onto the soft rug together in a tangle of arms and legs, exhaustion and euphoria mixing into an overwhelming emotion. Tears of pure joy streamed down Arthur's face. He wasn't crying from sadness or frustration, but from a feeling so big it couldn't be contained in his chest. He had walked. He, Arthur Caldwell, had walked. Leah hugged him fiercely, and they lay there, on the playroom floor, crying and laughing at the same time. Guardians of a secret that was about to change everything. They didn't know that on the other side of the door, an unexpected sound would make them freeze. The unmistakable crunch of Richard's car on the gravel, arriving home far earlier than usual. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway was like a fire alarm in the playroom sanctuary. Arthur and Leah's hearts hammered in unison. Icy panic replaced euphoria. "My dad!" Arthur gasped, his eyes wide with terror. They were on the floor, the wheelchair on the other side of the room, a silent testament to their secret feat. There was no time to think. Acting on pure instinct, Leah, with surprising strength, helped Arthur scramble behind a large teddy bear beanbag while she ran to grab the chair and bring it closer. They heard the front door open, Richard's voice echoing through the hall. "Helena! Arthur!" The voice was getting closer. They had to move fast. With a monumental effort, the two of them managed to get Arthur back into the chair, their breath coming in ragged gasps, muscles trembling from the exertion and adrenaline. Leah smoothed the blanket over his legs just a second before the playroom doorknob turned. Richard entered with a tired smile, which widened when he saw the two children together. "Did I interrupt something?" he asked, his tone light and affectionate. Leah, with an acting ability that would astound any theater director, just smiled and shook her head. "We were just telling stories," she said, her voice a little higher than usual. Arthur remained silent, his heart still pounding against his ribs, hoping his father wouldn't notice his flushed face and rapid breathing. Fortunately, Richard was distracted by his own thoughts. Had to come home early. A meeting was cancelled. Good thing, too. I get to spend some time with you two. He sat on the floor with them, and the immediate danger seemed to pass, but the fear left a residue, a keen awareness of how fragile their secret was. The joy of their achievement was now tempered by the anxiety of discovery. In the following days, they became even more careful, masters of the art of dissimulation. Their training sessions grew shorter and were held in the most remote corners of the garden. With every step Arthur took, with every extra second, he managed to balance. The desire to share the news with his father grew inside him. It was a delicious burden. News so good it burned to be told. He pictured the scene over and over in his mind. His father's look of shock, the disbelief melting into tears of joy, the hug that would surely follow. But fear still held him back. What if his father didn't believe him? What if he called the doctors? Who would say it was impossible and forbid them from continuing? Leah, sensing his anguish, advised him with her simple wisdom, "We have to be sure, Arthur, sure that the mountain really moved, not just a little bit." They decided they needed a grand test, a final proof, the target, the small angel fountain in the center of the garden, about 20 yards from the oak tree. To walk there on their own would be the proof they needed. The chosen day was a sunny Friday, the end of Leah's 3rd week. The atmosphere was charged with a nervous electricity. Richard was on a long video conference in his office, and Helena was busy in the other wing of the house. It was the perfect opportunity. Under the oak tree, Leah helped Arthur to his feet. He felt steadier than ever before. "Ready?" she whispered. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the fountain, which glistened in the sun like a trophy. They began their walk, side by side, without touching. The first steps were hesitant, Arthur's body still reacquainting itself with the forgotten mechanics of movement. But with each step, he gained confidence. The grass under his feet, the breeze on his face, the freedom. It was overwhelming. They were halfway there when euphoria took over. Arthur let out a laugh, a sound pure and free. He started to move faster, the clumsy steps turning into a stumbling run. Leah laughed with him, running alongside. She picked up a rubber ball that was lying nearby and tossed it to him. Instinctively, Arthur kicked it. The ball flew through the air in an awkward arc. They were so immersed in their world of miracles, in their bubble of joy, that they noticed nothing around them. They didn't see the office door open. They didn't see Richard step onto the terrace, cell phone to his ear, looking for a better signal. He stopped, frowning, looking at the empty wheelchair swaying in the wind. A cold panic shot up his spine. "Arthur!" he called out, his voice tense. He scanned the garden, his heart racing, and then he heard it, laughter, coming from behind the trees. He walked toward the sound, fear giving way to a growing confusion. As he rounded a large magnolia bush, he stopped dead. The cell phone slipped from his hand and fell to the grass. Forgotten. His eyes widened, his mind refusing to process the scene before him. It was his son, Arthur, running, kicking a ball with Leah. Richard blinked, certain that stress and lack of sleep were finally playing tricks on him. This couldn't be real. It was a hallucination, an impossible dream. Time seemed to freeze. For Richard, the world shrank to that surreal image. His son, whom the greatest specialists had condemned to a life on wheels, running awkwardly across the grass. His face lit by a smile he had never seen before. The sound of the children's laughter was real. The bouncing ball was real. The sun on his face was real. But the scene itself defied all logic, all the painful reality he had accepted for 4 years. His brain struggled to find an explanation, searching files of diagnoses, prognoses, and medical reports, but found nothing. It was like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. The shock was so profound it left him mute and motionless, a paralyzed spectator before the impossible. Arthur, seeing his father, stopped running abruptly. The smile on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of pure panic. The secret was out. The bubble had burst. "Dad," he whispered, the word nearly inaudible. He lost his balance and fell to a sitting position on the grass, more from shock than from lack of strength. Leah rushed to his side, protective. Richard finally managed to move. He took one step, then another, approaching slowly, as if he feared a sudden movement might break the spell. He knelt in front of Arthur, his eyes scanning his son's body, his legs, his feet, as if looking for wires or some magic trick. "Arthur, how?" was all he could manage, his voice hoarse with emotion and disbelief. He touched his son's leg, feeling the firm muscle beneath the fabric of his pants. It was real. It was solid. Before Arthur could answer, Leah, with the courage that defined her, stepped forward. "It was faith, Mr. Caldwell," she said, with the simplicity of someone stating that the sky is blue. "We asked with all our might, and he was able to push his mountain." The girl's words, so pure and devoid of scientific complexity, shook Richard even more. Faith, a mountain. These were concepts he had filed away in some forgotten corner of his mind, replaced by terms like muscular atrophy and irreversible neurological damage. He looked at his son's face, which now watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. And then, the dam of emotions Richard had held back for years finally broke. Hot, silent tears began to stream down his face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound, a joy so overwhelming that it ached. He pulled Arthur into a tight embrace, burying his face in his hair, his body shaking with contained sobs. "My son, my boy," he repeated, the words lost in the fabric of the boy's shirt. The news spread through the house like wildfire. Helena, when called to the garden, fell to her knees and wept, thanking God in an emotional prayer. Even the other staff members came to peek, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Only Sonia, the head housekeeper, watched from a distance, from the kitchen window, with an unreadable expression. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her narrowed eyes reflected not joy, but a cold, dark calculation. In the days that followed, the mansion, once a place of quiet routines, became a hub of activity. Richard, driven by a need for validation, to understand what had happened, called the doctors. The first was Dr. Evans, the pediatrician who had followed Arthur since birth. He arrived with his air of professional skepticism, listened to Richard's account, and examined Arthur with the expression of someone expecting to find a prank. But upon seeing the boy stand up and take a few steps, his facade of control crumbled. He stammered, asked to repeat the tests, and muttered phrases about spontaneous remission and unexplained phenomena. The news leaked. Other specialists came, neurologists, physical therapists, each with their clipboard and their theories. They prodded, measured, and scanned, but they found no answers. Arthur's recovery was an undeniable fact, but its cause was a mystery that science couldn't solve. And amidst all this commotion, Leah's simple, powerful explanation, faith, was consistently ignored, dismissed as childish fantasy. The world wanted an answer that could be measured and catalogued, and the faith of a 7-year-old girl didn't fit into any of their boxes. And this skepticism, like a storm cloud on the horizon, began to cast a shadow over the miracle. The Caldwell estate became a stage. Journalists camped outside the imposing gates, eager for a glimpse of the miracle boy. Nationally renowned doctors debated the case on television shows, using complex terms that tried to dissect the magic and turn it into science. The family's privacy was shattered, and the pure joy of Arthur's recovery began to be tinged with the grey colours of public opinion. For Richard, the attention was a burden. He just wanted to protect his son. to let him explore his new world without the pressure of being a phenomenon. But at the same time, he felt an obligation to share that hope, to show the world that perhaps the impossible wasn't so impossible after all. He was torn between the desire to hide and the need to bear witness. For Arthur, the change was confusing. Suddenly, his home was filled with strangers who stared at him with intense curiosity, asking him to walk for them as if it were a circus trick. The doctors, with their cold hands and repetitive questions, were the worst. They treated him like a puzzle to be solved, not a boy who just wanted to play. Arthur's only refuge was Leah. With her, he wasn't the miracle boy, he was just Arthur. They continued their games in the garden, trying to ignore the circus that had formed around them. Leah, with her keen intuition, sensed the pressure on her friend. She saw him withdraw into himself when the adults approached, saw the small worry line that formed between his eyebrows. She became his guardian, his shield. When a doctor asked Arthur to walk, it was Leah who held his hand, whispering words of encouragement. Her presence was what anchored him, what reminded him of the simple, pure origin of his strength. The first significant obstacle came in the form of Dr. Sterling, a neurologist famous for his skepticism and imposing media presence. Invited by Richard in the hope of getting a final validation, the doctor arrived with a team and an aura of superiority. He spent hours with Arthur, subjecting him to a battery of exhausting tests. At the end, in a meeting in Richard's office, he delivered his verdict with cutting coolness. "The recovery is, indeed, remarkable," he admitted, with the reluctance of someone conceding a point in a debate. "However, there is no evidence of neural regeneration. My hypothesis is that this is a classic case of psychosomatic conversion. The initial condition may have been exacerbated by emotional factors, and the presence of the girl," he said, waving a dismissive hand in the direction of Leah, who was sitting in a corner, acted as a catalyst, a powerful placebo, which unlocked a motor capacity that was always latent, albeit limited. He concluded, with a tone of finality, "It is likely temporary. Any significant emotional stress could trigger a regression." The words fell like stones in the silent room. Temporary, psychosomatic, placebo. They were clinical terms that stripped the miracle of its magic, reducing Leah's faith and Arthur's determination to a mere trick of the mind. Richard felt a surge of anger, but also of fear. What if the doctor was right? What if this happiness was just a loan with an expiration date? "Doctor," Sterling's skepticism planted a seed of doubt in Richard's heart, a weed that began to choke the joy. The second obstacle came from the outside, from society. Influential people, columnists, and even religious leaders began to question the methods behind the recovery. The story of Leah and her heart prayer was distorted, twisted into something exotic and suspicious. Some called it folk healing, others child manipulation. The simplicity of the act of faith was lost in a sea of cynical interpretations. Helena, once an anonymous figure, now saw her daughter's name being publicly debated. She was terrified, powerless to protect Leah from the world's malice. The little girl, who had only acted out of love, was being painted as a pint-sized charlatan. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and the atmosphere in the mansion, once celebratory, was now heavy with the tension of uncertainty and external judgment. Arthur's mountain had been moved, but now a new and darker mountain was rising before them all, the world's disbelief. The seed of doubt planted by Dr. Sterling began to sprout in the fertile ground of Richard's anxiety. He started watching Arthur with an almost feverish attention, analyzing every step, every stumble, every moment of hesitation. One day, Arthur, chasing a butterfly, tumbled on the lawn as any 4-year-old would. But to Richard, the sound of his body hitting the grass was like a starting pistol for panic. He ran, his heart in his throat, and as he lifted his son, he didn't ask if he was hurt, but rather, Can you still feel your legs?" Arthur, more startled by his father's reaction than the fall, just nodded, his eyes filled with confusion. The spontaneous joy of movement was being replaced by the pressure to prove, at every moment, that he was still able. Meanwhile, Sonia, the head housekeeper, observed everything from her strategic position at the heart of the house. The jealousy she felt for Helena and Leah had curdled into a venomous resentment. She saw Richard's gratitude toward the housekeeper, the way he now treated Helena almost as a confidant, and felt erased, devalued. Years of loyal service, and in her mind, were being overshadowed by a subordinate's good luck. The media attention, the doctors, the chaos, all of it, to Sonia, was the fault of that girl and her superstitions. She began to collect little pieces of evidence, twisting conversations she overheard, reinterpreting gestures. The herbal tea Helena brewed for Leah when she had a cold became, in her internal narrative, a suspicious potion. The massages Leah gave Arthur's feet during their games were unauthorized procedures. She was building a case in her mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came during the 4th week. The media pressure had reached a peak. A sensationalist TV show was planning a special report on faith healing in high society, and Arthur's case was the centerpiece. Richard was at the end of his rope, trying to shield his family from an exposure that was becoming increasingly grotesque. It was in this climate of paranoia and exhaustion that Sonia decided to make her move. She requested a private meeting with Richard, her face a mask of false concern. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice laden with rehearsed gravity, "I can no longer remain silent. My conscience won't allow it. I am concerned for young Arthur's well-being." She began to spin her web of lies, presenting her observations as facts. "I've seen it, sir. I've seen Helena giving the boy strange teas. And the girl, she does things, prayers, massages. It's not right. It's not scientific. Didn't Dr. Sterling say that stress could cause a regression? What if they are, unintentionally of course, putting unbearable psychological pressure on him, making him believe in things that aren't real?" Each word was a drop of poison, carefully chosen to exploit Richard's deepest fears. She insinuated that Arthur's improvement could be a coincidence, and that Helena and Leah's questionable practices could in fact be putting his health at risk. Richard, already shaken by the doctor's skepticism and the media's hounding, felt the ground give way beneath him. The doubt Dr. Sterling had planted was now a full-grown tree, and Sonia's words were the axe. He wanted to disbelieve her, to defend Helena, the woman who had been a pillar in his life. But the seed of fear was stronger. What if Sonia was right? What if, in his blind gratitude, he was allowing something dangerous to happen right under his roof? The image of his son regressing, returning to the wheelchair, was his ultimate nightmare. Sonia, sensing his hesitation, delivered the final blow. "I know this is difficult to hear, sir, but my duty is to the boy's safety. Perhaps it would be best if Helena and the girl were to step away for a while, just to see how Arthur reacts without that influence." The suggestion was cruel, but in Richard's exhausted and terrified mind, it sounded like a logical solution, a scientific test to isolate the variable. The thought of sending away the source of his son's joy tore him apart, but the fear of losing him to the illness again was even greater. He looked out the window and saw Arthur and Leah building a sandcastle, their heads close together in a world of innocence that he felt he was about to destroy. The envious housekeeper had cast her line, and the desperate father, in his moment of greatest weakness, was about to take the bait. Richard's decision weighed on his chest like an anchor. He spent the nights sleepless, pacing his office, a cold, frightened logic battling against gratitude and affection. Sonia's words, laced with venomous insinuation, echoed in his mind, mixing with Dr. Sterling's skeptical prognosis. He felt trapped, forced to choose between faith and reason, between loyalty and fear. By dawn, with dark circles under his eyes and his heart in pieces, he made the decision that, in his panic-distorted logic, seemed the only responsible one. He would call Helena in for a talk. Helena felt the shift in atmosphere as soon as she arrived that morning. The air in the mansion was heavy, charged with a tension she couldn't identify. When Richard summoned her to the office, her stomach clenched in a knot of apprehension. He couldn't look her in the eye. In a low, hesitant voice, he tried to explain his decision, using words like precaution, observation, and medical advice. He spoke of the media pressure, of the need to protect Arthur from unconventional influences. He never directly accused Helena or Leah, but the accusations were there, hanging in the air, implicit in every carefully constructed sentence. He asked her to take a paid leave of absence, to stay away for a while, until the dust settles. For Helena, every word was a slap in the face. She looked at the man she had served with dedication for so many years, the man whose pain she had shared, and saw a stranger ruled by fear, poisoned by whispers. The injustice of it was so overwhelming it left her breathless. Her daughter, with her pure heart, had worked a miracle, and now she was being punished for it. Dignity, however, was Helena's backbone. She did not cry, did not beg, did not defend herself. If the trust she had built over years could be undone by insinuations, then there was nothing left to say. She simply nodded, her lips trembling. "As you wish, sir," she said, her voice firm, despite the pain tearing through her. The farewell was the hardest thing Arthur had ever faced. When Helena told Leah they had to leave, the girl didn't understand. "But why? We haven't finished teaching Arthur how to jump," she protested, her dark eyes filling with confused tears. Arthur, who overheard the conversation from the doorway, felt a chill run down his spine. Leaving. Leah was leaving. No, it couldn't be. He ran to his father, his legs still a little unsteady. "Dad, don't let them. Leah can't leave. She's my friend." Richard knelt, his face a mask of pain. "Son, it's just for a little while. It's for your own good." "No, it's not," Arthur yelled. The first real tantrum of his life, born from the deepest anguish. "She helps me. She makes me strong." But his words were lost on the unyielding decision of a terrified adult. The moment Leah and Helena walked down the long hall toward the back door was torture. Leah looked back at Arthur, who stood in the middle of the foyer, his face streaked with tears. She wanted to run and hug him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the defeated look on her mother's face stopped her. It was the first time she had ever seen her mother look so fragile. Arthur watched the door close, and with it, a piece of his soul seemed to be ripped away. The silence that followed was heavier and more oppressive than any silence the mansion had ever known. Sonia watched the scene from the staircase, an almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She had won. The house was hers again, but her victory came at an immediate and devastating cost. That night, for the first time in weeks, Arthur felt a familiar weakness in his legs, a tremor that came not from exertion, but from something much deeper. It was the tremor of fear and loss. Dr. Sterling's prophecy was tragically beginning to come true. The days following Helena and Leah's departure were shrouded in a melancholic grey. The light seemed to have been drained from the mansion, and the laughter that had become the house's new soundtrack was replaced by a dense, uncomfortable silence. Arthur retreated into himself, building a fortress of silence. He spent most of his time in his room, refusing to go to the garden, which was now a painful reminder of the friend he had lost. The wheelchair, which had been relegated to a corner like an artifact from a past life, once again became the center of his existence. Not out of physical necessity, not yet, but as a refuge. Sitting in it, he felt safe, as if the metal frame could shield him from the pain of her absence. Richard watched his son's decline with growing desperation. The joy and vivacity had been replaced by an apathy that was terribly familiar. The weakness in Arthur's legs became more apparent each day. It started with a stumble, then difficulty climbing a single step, and soon he was hesitant to stand for any length of time. Richard called the doctors again. They shook their heads with an air of, "I told you so," muttering about the emotional stress that confirmed Dr. Sterling's theory of a psychosomatic condition. Each medical assessment was another nail in the coffin of Richard's hope, solidifying the terrible idea that he, in trying to protect his son, had caused the very damage he feared most. Guilt consumed him. He looked at his son's sad face and saw the reflection of his own failure. The image of Helena, dignified and wounded, haunted his thoughts. How could he have doubted her? How could he have allowed Sonia's poisonous words to find purchase in his heart? The housekeeper, for her part, tried to fill the void left by Helena and Leah, but her efforts were clumsy and cold. She brought Arthur the most expensive toys, prepared his favorite snacks, but she couldn't offer what the boy truly needed: the genuine connection, the faith, and the love that Leah had given him freely. Arthur ignored her, and his silent resentment was a constant accusation that made the air in the house even more suffocating. Far away, in her small, modest home, Leah was suffering too. She didn't understand the complexity of the adults' decisions. She only understood that she had been torn away from her friend. She asked about Arthur every day, and Helena, with a broken heart, tried to explain in a way a child could understand, but there was no explanation for an injustice so great. "They're scared, my love," she would say, stroking her daughter's hair. "Sometimes fear makes grown-ups do foolish things." Leah, in her childlike wisdom, sensed the problem ran deeper. She worried about Arthur. She knew his strength came not just from his muscles, but from his belief. And she feared that without her there to remind him to believe, his mountain might start to grow again. The lowest point came on a rainy afternoon at the end of the 5th week. Arthur, trying to reach a book on a shelf in his room, attempted to stand up from his chair. His legs trembled and gave out completely. He crumpled to the floor, not with a hard thud, but with a helpless slowness, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. He didn't cry. He just lay there on the rug, his face turned toward the window where raindrops traced paths like tears. It was the personification of defeat. In that moment, he surrendered. The belief Leah had ignited in him, the flame that had made him defy his destiny, had been extinguished, drowned in a sea of sadness and solitude. Richard, who entered the room at that exact instant, saw the scene and felt as if an icy hand was squeezing his heart. The regression was complete. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and the responsibility was entirely his. He had traded a miracle for fear, and the price of that trade was lying broken at his feet. It was in this abyss of despair that a new determination was born within him. He would fix what he had broken, no matter the cost. The first thing he had to do was find the truth. The sight of Arthur, limp and helpless on the floor, was the catalyst that turned Richard's despair into a cold, sharp resolve. He lifted his son into his arms, the small, light body feeling more fragile than ever, and gently placed him back in the wheelchair. As he arranged the blanket over the legs that had forgotten how to move, he felt a surge of fury, not at the doctors, not at fate, but at himself. He had failed his son in the most fundamental way. He had allowed fear to dictate his actions, and the consequence was the extinguished light in Arthur's eyes. That night, while Arthur slept fitfully, Richard locked himself in his office, not to work, but to hunt for the truth. Something didn't add up. The regression had been too swift, coinciding perfectly with Helena and Leah's departure. He refused to accept that their presence was a mere placebo. There had to be more. His mind, trained to find patterns and inconsistencies in the business world, began replaying the events that led to his catastrophic decision. Sonia's words, her rehearsed concern, her look of false compassion. It was then that an idea, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the fog of his guilt. The estate was equipped with a state-of-the-art security system, with discreet cameras covering nearly every room and outdoor area. He never checked them, trusting his staff completely. But now, trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. With hands trembling from a mix of hope and dread, he accessed the system. Weeks of footage lined up on his screen, a silent timeline of life in his home. He started searching for the evidence Sonia had mentioned. He looked for the scenes where Helena gave Arthur the strange tease. He found them, but as he rewound the footage, he saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw Sonia in the kitchen, minutes before Helena prepared the tea, discreetly adding a handful of strong-smelling herbs from her own pocket into the kettle, a calculated act to arouse suspicion. He continued his search, now with a different focus. He looked for moments of danger, for situations Sonia had described as risky procedures. He found footage in the garden of Arthur stumbling and nearly falling, only to be caught by Leah, but the camera from another angle showed what preceded it. Sonia, walking past moments before, absent-mindedly, dropping a small toy car directly in Arthur's path. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. This wasn't negligence. It was sabotage, a deliberate, cruel campaign to frame Helena and drive her from the house. He clicked through the recordings, each clip a new layer of betrayal. He saw Sonia talking with other staff, casting glances toward Helena, her gestures clearly spreading poison and distrust. The final, most devastating piece came from a camera in the upstairs hallway. It showed Sonia, on the day of Dr. Sterling's visit, standing outside the office door, her ear pressed to the wood, absorbing every word, every diagnosis, every one of Richard's vulnerabilities. She wasn't just jealous. She was armed with the knowledge of her employer's greatest fears and had used them against him with surgical precision. Richard pushed back from the screen, his face pale. Nausea rose in his throat. He hadn't just been deceived, he had been complicit. He had delivered his son's happiness into the hands of a manipulator, all because he allowed himself to be blinded by the very fear she had helped cultivate. He had allowed one woman's envy to destroy the person who had given his son the greatest gift in the universe. The pain of his guilt was excruciating. But beneath it, a cold rage began to form, a clear and objective fury. He knew exactly what he had to do. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. He picked up the phone, his face a mask of stone. The time for fear was over. It was time to fight. Richard's first call was not to Helena, but to the head of his personal security team. The instruction was simple and chilling. Ensure that Sonia packed her belongings and was off the property immediately, without a scene. Minutes later, he summoned her to the office. She entered with an air of smug efficiency, ready to be praised for her vigilance. Instead, she found Richard with his back to her, staring at the large screen on the wall, which was dark. "Sonia," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "I've been reviewing a few things. I'd like your opinion." He pressed a button, and the screen came to life. The image was sharp, the kitchen, and Sonia, her back to the camera, surreptitiously adding herbs to Helena's kettle. He said nothing, just let the scene play on a silent loop. The color drained from the housekeeper's face. She opened her mouth to protest, to invent an excuse. But then he switched the scene. Now it was the garden, and the small toy car falling accidentally from her hands. The only sound in the room was her own breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. Her facade of dignity disintegrated, revealing the petty, envious woman beneath. "Your belongings are being packed. You have 10 minutes, Richard said, finally turning to face her, his eyes as cold as ice. She didn't argue. She just turned and left. A shrunken figure, defeated by her own malice. With the house purged of its poison, the most difficult task still lay ahead. Richard grabbed his car keys. A phone call wouldn't be enough. A text message wouldn't convey the depth of his regret. He had to go to them. He drove through neighborhoods he had never seen, trading the wide, tree-lined avenues of his world for narrower streets and modest but lively homes. He found Helena's small apartment. With pots of colorful geraniums in the window, the sight of that simple, honest home only deepened his shame. When Helena opened the door, her face showed cautious surprise. Richard didn't wait. The words poured out of him in a torrent of remorse. "Helena, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, a coward. I let fear blind me, and I listened to the lies of a cruel person. I know an apology isn't enough to erase the pain I caused you and your daughter, but I am here to beg for your forgiveness, and to beg you to come back. Not for me, for Arthur. He needs you. He needs Leah." He told her everything he had discovered, not omitting his own monumental failure. Helena listened in silence, her heart softening at the sight of this powerful man, now so broken and humbled. She saw the truth in his tear-filled eyes. For Arthur's sake, she nodded. The return to the mansion was quiet, fraught with an almost unbearable expectation. Arthur was in the living room, listless in his wheelchair, watching the rain through the window. The door opened. He didn't turn. Then, a small voice called his name. "Arthur." He froze. That sound, it was her voice. He turned slowly, and there she was, Leah, standing in the entryway, her dark eyes shining, a hesitant smile on her lips. For an instant, the world stopped. For Arthur, it was as if the sun had burst into the grey room. A force, long dormant, surged through his body, an electric current that started in his heart and shot down to the tips of his toes. He looked at his legs. He looked at Leah, and faith, pure and unshakable, returned with the force of a flood. "Leah!" he cried out, his voice full of a joy that ached. He pushed up on the arms of his chair, using all the strength he had. His legs trembled, but they held. Before the shocked and hopeful eyes of the adults, Arthur Caldwell stood up, and then he took a step and another. He was walking toward his friend, toward his healing. The reunion wasn't just a moment, it was a restoration. Arthur's steps toward Leah, each one firmer than the last, were the rebuilding of a bridge of faith that had been dynamited by fear and betrayal. When he finally reached her, they said nothing, they just hugged. Two small bodies clinging to each other, as if they were the only real thing in a confusing world. In that embrace, the strength he had lost not only returned but solidified, anchored in the certainty of their unconditional friendship. Richard and Helena watched, tears streaming freely, witnessing not a repeated miracle, but the confirmation that true healing lay not in muscles or nerves, but in human connection, in the power of one soul to believe in another. The 6 weeks that followed transformed the Caldwell mansion from a house into a home. The wheelchair was stored in the attic, not as a ghost of the past, but as a reminder of the journey they had taken. Richard, humbled and changed by his ordeal with fear and error, made profound changes. He promoted Helena, no longer the housekeeper, but the official household manager and Arthur's caregiver, a title that merely formalized the role she had always played in their hearts. He insisted that Leah be enrolled in the same private school as Arthur, ensuring that distance would never again separate them. Leah and Helena did not become employees. They became family, filling the void left by Beatrice's absence with a warmth and vitality that money could not buy. The subplot with Sonia found its resolution when Richard discreetly ensured her actions were made known in their professional circle, making it impossible for her to harm other families with her manipulations. Justice was served not with vengeance, but with the simple exposure of truth. The story of Leah's grandmother also came to light. Helena, finally feeling safe, shared that her mother had been a well-known and respected folk healer in her small Appalachian hometown, a woman whose wisdom came not from books, but from a deep connection to faith and nature. Leah, they realized, wasn't just repeating words she had heard. She had inherited her grandmother's gift, the rare ability to awaken healing in others through pure love and a genuine belief in their inner strength. The garden, once an oasis of silent perfection, now constantly echoed with the most beautiful sound in the world. The laughter of two children running freely. They played tag, kicked a soccer ball, and explored every corner of the property. Arthur, the boy whose determination made him strive to reach the unreachable, could now run toward any horizon he chose. His emotional vulnerability, once an open wound whenever he saw other children play, had transformed into a deep empathy, an understanding of others, pain that made him an extraordinary friend. On a golden afternoon, 6 weeks after Leah's arrival, Richard watched them from the terrace. Arthur and Leah were lying on the grass, pointing at the clouds and making up stories about their shapes. Where once there was only the silence of a stationary wheelchair, there was now the fullness of life. The miracle wasn't just Arthur's recovery. The true miracle was the transformation of them all. Richard learned that a father's true strength wasn't in shielding his son from the world, but in having the courage to trust in what cannot be explained. Helena learned that dignity and loyalty are, in the end, rewarded. And Arthur, the boy who had never walked, discovered that sometimes all we need to move our own mountains is someone to hold our hand, look us in the eye and say, with all the certainty in the universe, "I believe in you."